Thank you, as Matt said, for coming along this evening. We've got some music and some video to show you, and hopefully some information which will challenge you, and I hope more than anything will really encourage you and fire you up as Matt finishes off this evening together. You might have been looking at some of the publicity and you're wondering what it's all about. You know, when you see a world without mirrors. What is it you see when you look in a mirror? I know that when you look in a mirror you sort of see the reflection of yourself and the background around you. But this evening I want to sort of take us on a little bit of a journey and try to understand and unpack the idea of when we look in a mirror, is that all we see portrayed there? Is there something more than what we see just in the mirror? You know, it's a bit like when you look at a painting. All we can see is paint, or is there something a little bit more profound? When we listen to music, do we listen to music and we think they're just notes? Or is there something more going on there when the notes come together and form something quite amazing? So when we look in a mirror, is there something more than what we see on the surface? If I'm honest, I think, or we're honest, many of us, when we look in a mirror, probably, if you're anything like me, anyone like me, then I just spend a few seconds in front of the mirror every day. Maybe that's for shaving or for getting a tie on and things like that. Some of us might spend a little bit longer looking in the mirror, just making sure that we've got our clothes right, we've got the hat right, we've got no spots and things like that. So we use the mirror like this. And the idea came to me when I was on my recent trip to Central America. Made me think a lot about this and how children on the streets see themselves. Someone asked me, they came out on the streets one day and they were fairly new to working on the streets, and I was showing them around, and they wanted to know why the children seemed so keen on the photographs that I took. And I promised the children, and they know, and some of them are young adults now, and they know that if I take a photograph of them, that they know within a few days I will go back and give them a physical printed copy of that photograph. And they were asking now, why is it that children, just when they get these photographs, just sit and ponder over the photographs? And I said, well, it's because they live in a world without mirrors. And that's where the idea came from. You see, for street children, they don't really have the opportunity to look at themselves and to see who they are. And if they did, I wonder what they would see. Would they see just the external surface, or would they see something more profound, something more penetrating? Maybe something more revealing than just what is revealed in front of them on a piece of paper. But for the children that live on the streets, they live in a world without mirrors. And in a recent book, one of the newest books on street children by Andrew Williams, he talks in the book about a time when he was setting up a refuge for street children in Uganda. And he said that he'd heard about a project working with street kids in Sri Lanka. And he said in the book, he said, I stole their idea of fitting full-length mirrors in the refuge. And he said what was amazing is that as these boys came off the streets, these street children in Uganda, he said they sat, or they stood in front of these full-length mirrors, and he said for many of them it was the first time they'd ever seen themselves, their whole selves, from top to bottom. And so that was what I was trying to explain to my visitor as I was taking him out on the streets that day. Why children live in a world without mirrors, and how for them they see themselves. And it's interesting because, as I was saying to this person I took out on the streets, the kids themselves shout at me sometimes when I get quite close with the camera, and they go, "Duncan, take all of me." That's the scream I get the most. You know, because I quite like to get some nice close-up photographs. But always they ask, take all of me. I want to see every part of me. You see, where children live in a world without mirrors, the photographs that I take help them see themselves for who they really are. And maybe when they start looking at those photographs, they then see themselves in the context of a life on the streets. And I hope that as they do that, and as we come alongside them, that they then can begin to see that there may be a possibility of an alternative life for themselves. I'd like to take us back 20 years in our sort of journey we're going to go on for the next hour and a bit, because it was 20 years ago that my wife Jenny and daughter Caitlin and I, as many of you remember, flew out to Guatemala City. And we moved out there after seeing this documentary, a documentary called They Shoot, put it up on the screen, the slide, They Shoot Children, Don't They? And when we saw this text that came across the screen, They Shoot Children, Don't They? We were not expecting this programme to come up. We were just watching the news, and then at the end of the news, this 20 odd years ago, this programme came up, and it said, as you hear now, quite how harrowing that would be. And I'd like to just show you just a couple of minutes at the beginning of that clip. Thanks, Matt.
Me disparó como vio que no me pudo alcanzar, me disparó.
¿Y cuántas veces te disparó?
2.
2 veces. A ver, enséñame las heridas, si puedes. Entonces ahí estaba todavía la bala en el brazo, ¿verdad? Tienes suerte, ¿verdad? ¿Ah? Porque entre aquí y aquí tienes riñón, tienes corazón, tienes pulmón.
Y ni lloré ni nada, no lloré. Cuando me tiraron ni lloré ni nada, solo seguí caminando.
¿Y tú te diste cuenta que te había baleado?
There are 5,000 street children in Guatemala City. Each day they set out to literally live or die on the streets. They rob at night and in the morning sell their stolen goods. The money they make buys food and glue. Sniffing glue stops the cold and the hunger. Guatemala has a long history of violence. It's now a democracy, but decades of dictatorship have left the army and the police still using brutally repressive measures against those they see as a problem. In recent years, this has included the street children.
If a child through his or her upbringing has not had a family support system, has not had the opportunity to go to school, has not had the luxury to look forward to the future, but is more worried about what they're going to eat, how can you expect them to be good children? I first became aware of the problem with the case of 13-year-old Nahaman Carmona Lopez. Last March, Nahaman was sitting on this corner on 12th Street of Guatemala City. A policewoman and 4 policemen came up with a gun pointed at the kids. Most of them escaped, but the policemen caught 4 and poured their glue over their heads. Nahaman resisted. 11-year-old Luis was one of the children with him and saw what happened.
Le pegaron una patada, estoy aquí, como en la costilla parece. Entonces, de allí cuando él mejor, de allí se levantó, de allí más para bajito, se puso así a popear y así todo. Entonces, de allí se manchó de popó. Entonces, de allí le dijimos, nada más levántate, no, déjeme aquí. Y así se quedó él.
And he had 6 broken ribs, 2 broken fingers, severe concussion, bruising over 70% of his body, and a 10-centimeter gash on his back. He was unconscious in hospital for about 10 days. and then he died about 5:20 in the morning.
A year later, I was living out there and meeting almost all those children, and I remember, to try to remember all their names, writing down their names in a tiny little book that I kept in my pocket. 3 years later, I went through the book and looking at all the names, as many of you know what I'm going to say next. 80% of those children were then dead, just 3 years later. The plight of children living on the streets in our world cities has been a feature of many books and journals over many years, and it's not until the early 1990s, I suppose, when the world started to realise the enormity of the problem and also the danger that the children were in. There was the BBC Everyman documentary at the beginning of 1990. Then some of you might remember the BBC documentary that featured Jaime Jaramillo, the sewer children from Bogota, Colombia. And also then there was in 1993 the killing of 8 street children in just outside the Candelaria Church in Rio de Janeiro. And this is where those children were shot down. And so, at that time, at the beginning of the 1990s, the world's attention was then forced on this issue of street children. And the UN decided to bring it up on one of their main items on the UN agenda. In 1994, the Commission for Human Rights met to discuss the growing phenomenon of children living on the streets. And at that point, this is how they defined children living on the streets. They said that a street child is a girl or a boy for whom the streets become his or her habitual abode for a source of livelihood, and who is inadequately protected, supervised or directed by responsible adults. Since that moment, the term street child throughout the world carried negative connotations. So street children were then seen in a really negative term. Now, the United Nations at that point estimated, and it was an estimate, there to be 100 million children living on the streets worldwide. And many agencies took hold of that and used that as a basis to raise millions of pounds for all sorts of charities, many of them now not working with street children. But they also were then contesting that number, 100 million, as well as how you define a street child. Now, while organisations spent thousands flying from one place to the other around the world trying to decide exactly how many children are on the streets and how to define a street child, street children every single day were dying. So regardless of the numbers and regardless of how you define a street child, there were still hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of children living on the streets of our world today. And tonight we'll go to sleep on the streets, and many of them will wonder if they'll ever wake up. The 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child constitutes the main international instrument for the protection of street children, well, protection of the rights of the child, including street children, and it demonstrates the importance that states accord to the protection of children and for their rights. So after moving to Guatemala in 1992, I began working out on the streets with my very limited Spanish, and started to try to communicate to these children that somebody cared for them, that somebody loved them. Now, these are children who didn't really want to be befriended by adults. They found it really struggle knowing the experience that they've been through to trust somebody else. These were children that had survived despite all the odds, and yet day by day they were still existing and going through this experience called life. Many of you know I wrote a book then about street children called Miracle Children, and I'd like to read you from just a couple of pages that for me was one of the most profound experiences that I'd ever had in my first few weeks on the streets of Guatemala City. I sat down next to him and told him my name. He seemed unconcerned who I was and what I wanted. All he was interested in was another sniff from his bag of glue. The small group of street children began playing a game of football in the alley that was littered with rubbish and human excrement. A ball landed on my lap. I picked it up and tossed it to the children. It was soft, made of plastic, and had obviously landed in numerous piles of excrement which had disguised its real colour. The boy I was seeking to communicate with was thin, aged about 12, with black hair, glazed eyes. Eventually he told me his name. It was Reuben. Only later did I find out that Reuben was a runaway. He'd grown up in a home where his father would often beat him. One day his father hit him so bad that he ran away from home and never went back. However, he did maintain contact with his mother, who he often saw in the marketplace. The following week I saw Reuben again, and pulling up an old cardboard box from the rubbish pile, I sat down next to him. This time he was more eager to talk, and had obviously not had too many bags of glue that day. His face was brighter, and he was concentrating on what I was saying. "Reuben," I said, "I know that your life has been hard in the past, but it doesn't have to be that way in the future. You can make something of your life if you just put some effort into it." I could see he was listening to what I was saying, but while wanting to believe it was possible, he couldn't leave what he had come to know as his home, his family, his life, the streets. "We all die, you know," he replied. I looked at his face. He was looking at his feet. His feet were black and covered with dirt, oil and sores. He began picking at his toes as I looked up to see the other children beginning another game of street walls football. "But Reuben," I said, "you don't have to live like this. You don't have to die like the rest. You're smart, can choose a different path. Besides, God will help you if you ask him." "Come on, Reuben," came a shout from the alley where the children were playing. Reuben stood up and wandered over to where the action was. I saw Reuben only a few times after that evening. The last time I saw him, he was dead in a crude wooden box. Reuben and his two friends, Daniel, who was 10, and Manuel, who was 12, had found a place to rest that night, just 2 streets away from where I had been talking with Reuben. The boys found a shop doorway and began to huddle together to keep warm. No sooner they'd fallen asleep, they were rudely awakened by a lady who was well known in the area for being somewhat mentally unstable, and began to scream at the boys. The boys sat up and listened to her screams. She was obviously accusing them of something. The time was nearly midnight, but even though it was late, there were still many people coming and going. Within minutes, the lady had quite a crowd of people around her. The small crowd and not so small commotion caught the attention of 2 private police officers who were patrolling the area. They approached the boys, pulled out their guns, and shot 2 of them point blank range. Reuben and Daniel slumped to the ground dead. That, for me, was one of the hardest times of my life, because the next day I then had to carry the coffin of little Reuben and Daniel and bury them. And then, as the months went on, we buried more and more children. Street children are typically aged between 8 and 14, and they are predominantly boys. The majority of children on the streets are engaged in substance abuse. They're engaged in early sexual activity, delinquency, and have been abandoned, orphaned, runaways from abusive families. They're always seen as a nuisance. They're always seen as a threat and a problem. And since they're not seen as victims, they're then likely to be subjected to threats and to violence, rather than afforded support and comfort and love.
All around me are familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces, bright and early for their daily races, going nowhere, going nowhere. Their tears are filling up their glasses, no expression, no expression. Hide my head, I wanna drown my sorrow. No tomorrow, no tomorrow. And I find it kind of funny
kinda sad. The dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had. I find it hard to tell you, I find it hard to take. When people run in circles, it's a very, very mad world. Mad world. Children waiting for the day they feel good. Happy birthday, happy birthday. And to feel the way that every child should sit and listen, sit and listen. Went to school and I was very nervous. No one knew me, no one knew me. Hello teacher, tell me what's my lesson. Look right through me, look right through me. And I find it kinda funny, I find it kinda sad. The dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had. I find it hard to tell you, I find it hard to take. When people run in circles, it's a very, very mad world. Mad world. Enlarging your world. Mad world.
I believe that children should live without violence in an environment that can try to offer them some support, education, encouragement and love. And Street Kids Direct believes that change is possible. Despite the overwhelming statistics that could even daunt the most faithful of supporters, we believe in hope. And over the last 20 years, we've seen a growing change in how street children are treated, how they're defined, how they're counted, how they're protected, how they're cared for, how they're understood. And as some of you know, many people in this community 20 years ago told me that I was mad to go out into the country that was then in the midst of a civil war and believe that I could make a difference. To believe that going out there could actually do something to benefit the lives of those children. And I remember meeting with a committee of people not far from here who, whilst applauding my efforts of going out to Guatemala, were saying that I was probably heading for an early death. So with that encouragement, I began to reach out to children who were described by Susan Agnelli, who's the author of the first academic study into street children. She said this: children who live alone, these are street children, undernourished since birth, who are denied affection, education and help, who live without love, children whom the world tries to forget or ignore, children who see adults as their enemies, children nobody smiles to, nobody cuddles, nobody protects, nobody comforts. 20 years of my journey really can't be summed up in one short presentation this evening. And as many of you know, there have been many dark times. There's been many times of despair, tragedy, loss, abandonment, disappointment. But there's also been a lot of encouragement, a lot of support, a lot of prayer, and a lot of fun. Also, a lot of hope. Working in this field, when you're working with street children, you're working doing this work, doesn't come without its own risks or personal costs. But I believe that this is a call that God has on my life and something that I really want to continue to dedicate the rest of my life to. Some of you want a little bit of an update, and I wanted to tell you just for the next few minutes something about what happened during my 3 months away. Some of you probably didn't even realise I'd been away. It shows you how much you missed me. But 3 months in Guatemala and Honduras. And I must tell you that that time away inspired me beyond my wildest expectations, as I began to get a glimpse of something that I know God put on my heart 20 years ago. And that is that change is possible and the hope does not disappoint us. We can have a look at some of the pictures now, because street work. You'll be interested to know that on that the BBC video clip, okay, this is 20 years ago, but do you remember how many children were living in Guatemala City at that point? Anybody? Correct. Well done, Ben Dow. Star for you. 5,000 children. That number has now dropped to around 400 to 500 in the whole of Guatemala. As time has gone on, year by year, we've seen the numbers of street children declining. As we've worked to try to rescue them off the streets, put them into children's homes. We've worked in areas where the children have come from, and we've tried to prevent more children coming from marginal areas into the city and ending up on the streets. But numbers have been falling. More recently, over the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen larger numbers of children, rather than leaving marginal areas and heading to the streets. We've seen so many of them now getting involved in gangs. And gang involvement in Central America is one of the biggest issues that the governments, in a recent meeting I went to with the ministers and ambassadors from the Central American nations, with the UK government in London, this was one of the biggest issues they said that they needed to tackle. The gangs and the growth in gangs and the violence that's gone along with that. But I still believe in change. I still am hopeful that the numbers can continue to drop. And I want to say that in one of the visits I had, we decided to take a group of street kids to the beach for the day. This, if you could have seen us walking along with 20 kids in tow, with blankets over them as we picked them up early in the morning and herded them onto a bus, with a whole pack of their dogs following us behind as the bus took off, with the kids leaning out the window, shouting at the dogs, come on, keep up. And these poor old dogs, you know, as the bus got to the dual carriageway, the dogs were still trying to keep up with the bus. It was quite an amazing thing. And for some of these children, it was their first visit to the beach. And it was an amazing experience for them. And it just gives them a little bit of a glimpse that life could be different. Gives them a chance to maybe look in the mirror and say, could life be different than just living on the streets? And then I met this lady. Her name is Yesenia, and she was ridiculously keen to see me. Now, I hadn't seen her for about 3 or 4 years. So I was trying to remember her name. She said, do you remember me? I'm Yesenia. Yesenia, of course I remember you. I can't remember your name, but Yesenia, of course. And I remember her, but I was trying to remember the context in which I was the last time I met her. And she said, do you remember? She said, last time you met me, I was on the streets with my 2 girls, and now I'm not on the streets. She said, my life has completely changed around. And I was like, wow, that is amazing. And I remember this photograph, these 2 photographs that I took when I met her on the streets for the very first time. Some of you might have noticed these photographs opposite Tesco Express in Amersham. There's a building there, and they have 2 posters up, and these girls featured in those posters. And she said to me, you said something to me that night that made me change my life. Now, I can't remember anything. I can't remember yesterday, let alone years ago, what I said to her. But I must have said something, because she said, it made me think. And she said, so I went to church the next day. She said, I gave my life over to God. And as a result of that, I left the streets. I put my girls into education. I got a job. I rented a flat. And she said, my life is now completely changed. It's amazing how much her life has changed around, and that was really encouraging. Another thing that was encouraging going out on the streets was finding volunteers. Volunteers who would just come out and work with the kids for me. More people in Guatemala seem to have more of a desire now Guatemalan people to go out and reach out on the streets and help the children there. So that for me was really another encouraging thing. There's more to come about encouragement from Guatemala, but I'm going to move on to Honduras and tell you a little bit about moving to AFE. AFE is the name of the project that works with the children on the rubbish dump. And I remember when I first went there over 10 years ago, it was just this guy Johnny with his daughter and his wife picking up kids off the rubbish dump and taking them, sitting them under a tree and working with them. And when I got there, he said, we now have 4 classrooms. And I said, where are they? And he said, well, under that tree is year 3. He said, under that tree is the year 5 and 6. And under that, and that's how he began on the streets and on the rubbish dump, reaching out to the children. And as the years has gone on, we've been able to build a school there, and it's exciting to see we now have 140 children of the 250 children estimated that are working on the rubbish dump. 140 of those are now coming to the school every day. And a few years ago, we were asked, the Street Kids Direct, please will you raise money so that we can start a nursery. And Matt came out to the dump and with these ladies with the babies, shoving the babies in Matt's face, which is pretty scary in itself, and saying, you know, we need somewhere, because they were showing us, they said, when we go to work, we put this baby in a cardboard box. Now we're hoping that nothing drives over that cardboard box, and that in a few hours' time, we come back to see that baby is still there. Sometimes the baby is. So we sent over funds, we raised money, and a lot of you are involved, if not all of you are involved in raising money, and we were able to open this nursery. And it was great to go and visit the nursery, to see how the little kids are doing, and to see that the nursery had doubled in size since my last visit there. So that was really encouraging to me. We're also at AFE building another educational block, which is the big footings that are going in here. That's the toilet block on the left-hand side. 2 cubicles for boys, 2 for girls. And it's quite interesting the way that sometimes with the children, they come from the dump, the staff say, some of the children have never used a toilet before, and you have to show them how to use a toilet. And so we're building a new clinic. There's going to be new toilets in there, and a new educational area for vocational training for the children. And I want to show you a photograph of some of the children now. That the boy in the middle, I remember him. It's the same boy on the top left-hand side. And I remember some of these girls when we first went out onto the rubbish dump. And I remember René Daniel, the boy in the middle, because we videoed him, and I was trying to find this video footage, about 20 videotapes, so I couldn't find it. But we're videoing him as a little child and saying, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he said, if I can just be the person that drives the rubbish truck. That was his aspiration. That's all he could see that his life would ever achieve, driving that truck. And when I was there in January, he and 8 of his friends had graduated from AFE and were starting university. He now wants to be a doctor. The others want to be other professional people, not like myself. But it's so encouraging to see the way that as they come in and they've been educated, and they've learned that hope has grown in their hearts, and they've realised that they can do something a little bit better than just driving the rubbish truck. And so these are our first group of students that have graduated right the way through the AFE school, and now going off to university. And then this year will be this coming year we'll be welcoming more ready to go off to university the following year.